Our Old Testament reading this morning is from the book of Daniel. And if you remember, at the beginning of the book of Daniel, Nebuchadnezzar has taken Daniel and 3 of his friends captive so that they would serve in the Babylonian court. And he's renamed Daniel's friends Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And our reading is from chapter 3 today. And in chapter 3, Nebuchadnezzar has set up a large golden statue, and he's decreed that everybody will bow down and worship this. But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego do not. And word gets to Nebuchadnezzar. He brings them in, and he tells them, if you do not worship the golden statue, you'll be put into a furnace of blazing fire. And this is their response to Nebuchadnezzar. These are verses 16 through 18 of chapter 3. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to present a defense to you in this matter. If our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the furnace of blazing fire and out of your hand, O king, let him deliver us. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods, and we will not worship the golden statue that you have set up. May God add blessing to the reading and the understanding of this scripture. You're invited to stand as you're able for the reading of the gospel. The gospel reading this morning is from the gospel according to Mark. This is chapter 9, verses 2 through 9. This is the Transfiguration. Jesus took with him Peter and James and John and led them up a high mountain apart by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his clothes became dazzling white, such as no one on earth could bleach them. And there appeared to them Elijah with Moses, who were talking with Jesus. Then Peter said to Jesus, Rabbi, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. He did not know what to say, for they were terrified. Then a cloud overshadowed them, and from the cloud there came a voice. This is my son, the beloved. Listen to him. Suddenly, when they looked around, they saw no one with them anymore, but only Jesus. As they were coming down the mountain, he ordered them to tell no one about what they had seen until after the Son of Man had risen from the dead. This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God.
This morning, I get the privilege of wrapping up the season of Epiphany, the season of Aha, that began all the way back when the Magi came to give gifts to the newborn king, and takes us now to the cusp of Lent, which begins this week. By the way, can you believe that journey has only been 6 weeks? I also get the privilege of closing out this series that Pastor Nanette has been leading us on, called Called and Sent. And in it, we began by looking at John the Baptizer and his call to be a voice in the wilderness. So too have we looked at the way that God uses the cynics, like how God uses Eli in the call of Samuel. And we've looked at how God can use people even like Nathaniel. We looked at how God often uses the most unlikely cast of characters, the people that we would put at the bottom of the list, whether that be Rahab or the man who is demon-possessed in the tombs. And so we've gone on this journey looking at the way that God calls us and God sends us. And so we've talked about, last week, Pastor Nanette challenged us, can we recognize the places in different times throughout our life where God has spoken to us, where we've seen little glimmers of hope and possibility, and can we recognize the call of God in our life, and can those things be enough? And then this week we come to Transfiguration Sunday. We read Mark's account of this very odd story. And as I said at the beginning of the service, this is a story that I think is less meant for us to figure out what it means and more meant for us to just experience. Because it's inexplicable, it is extraordinary, it's beyond our comprehension. We can't make full sense of it. But if we wait long enough, perhaps we can see ourselves in the story. I can see myself in this story. It's not in the long hike up the mountain. I've told you before that I do enjoy climbing mountains, but it's so cold outside right now that if I think about it, I shiver. So that's not where I see myself. It's not in Jesus' inner circle with Peter and James and John. That's not what it's about. It's not about hearing the voice of God, although that has happened at certain times in my life. It's certainly not about the dazzling white. I can hardly keep an outfit clean through a meal. Or maybe you were with us this summer in outdoor worship when I poured communion juice all over my very favorite shirt. No, those aren't the places that I see myself in this story. Where I see myself is in Peter and his response when all of a sudden he becomes afraid and he says, let me build some houses. He says something that really at its core, and maybe we don't understand it when we first read it, but is sort of dumb. That's where I see myself. Sometimes I come to places where I probably ought to say nothing. The scriptures say that the disciples are terrified. And so James and John do what you're supposed to do. They say nothing, but Peter opens his mouth and puts his foot in it, as Peter is so inclined to do. And I love that about him, because I resemble that remark. And so I see myself there. Maybe you do as well. But if we were to zoom out even wider in this story and look at it as a whole from maybe a 30,000 foot view, I also see myself in this story because of what it is. At its fundamental level, this is a mountaintop experience. This is an experience of the divine that goes beyond comprehension. There's no mathematical formula that will make it make sense, but it's some encounter that we can scarcely find words to explain. And the writer of Mark is doing something very intentional as he speaks about it. He's hearkening back to the Hebrew history just before what Sean read this morning. It says 6 days later, which ought to have turned the original audience on to the idea that this was somehow connected to what God had done at various points in the Old Testament. And then there is this encounter where they go up the mountain and there they meet God. That's something that we see over and over in the Old Testament. In fact, Moses, one of those who will appear at the top of the mountain, he goes up to the mountain to communicate with God. And the writers, in trying to explain what that looked like, how do you explain what is inexplicable, what is extraordinary? They say there was like a cloud with lightning and thunder around it. They describe that later. They would say that when Moses went to meet with God in the tent of meeting, he would come out and his face glowed so much that nobody could even look at him. He had to wear a veil. They're grasping for words to explain situations that are fundamentally unable to be explained. Or Elijah. Elijah also goes and has a mountaintop experience. And in fact, it comes at his deepest valley. He's tired. And he goes up to the mountain and God says, I will meet you there. And all of a sudden there is a strong wind that breaks apart the rocks, but God is not in the wind. And then there is an earthquake, but God is not in the earthquake. And then there is fire, but God is not in the fire. No, God is in the sound of the still small voice, what may be translated as the sound of sheer silence. That happens for Elijah on the mountain. So when I talk about mountaintop experiences, there's a genre that we're talking about. Now, they don't have to happen on a mountaintop. They can happen in everyday life. In fact, I think sometimes there are miraculous things that we miss that happen around us because they feel so ordinary. I want to tell you about one mountaintop experience that I had. When I was a sophomore in college, one of my friends and fraternity brothers died in a car accident on I-70. It was a freak accident, a mechanical failure. 3 of my friends were in the car, and 1 passed away. And it was in the midst of a season that for us had been going quite well, both within my fraternity and my various communities on campus, within the football that was happening in the fall, and all of the things that happen on a college campus. Things were going really well until they weren't. Until that mid-morning Sunday when the accident happened. And what happened is that for many of us who had never experienced such great or such sudden loss, it plunged us into a whole variety of seasons of grief and ununderstanding and not being sure exactly what we were to do with the reality of the situation. There was confusion and anger and all the things that grief brings with it. I remember about a week later, I was driving from Kansas City back to Manhattan. It was late in a November evening. The sky was as clear as could be. The air was cold. And I remember in my processing, I was angry and sad and frustrated and uncertain and going back and forth and all of this. And I came to the point where I just had to stop the car. So I pulled off to some exit in the middle of nowhere and got out into the crisp night air. And I began to yell and to scream and to cry. And maybe you've been there before, screaming at thin air, at the open sky, screaming at God, asking questions, being angry. And I did this until I ran out of things to say. And then I stood there silently. And in that silence, there was this stillness that came about me. And I don't mean stillness as in the lack of motion, of the physical body moving. I mean, within me, there was a stillness that set into my soul. And perhaps you could call it a calm or a peace. And it was something that felt as if it was from without that came within. And really, friends, that's about all that I can say to explain it. There aren't many words beyond that. What I can tell you is that the outcome, there were two things that came out of it for me that were clear as day, that had not been clear before. And I don't know where they came from, except that it was some encounter of the extraordinary of God. And the two things that came to me were this. Number one, there was this deep assurance that in some way that I couldn't understand, that I couldn't explain or name or draw up, there was this assurance that my friend who had passed away was okay. And the second thing was this, that God had not abandoned him or me or any of us in the midst of this, even if there were times where it felt like that was so. Do you have a mountaintop experience? Some inexplicable place where you encountered something that you weren't ready for, that you didn't know was coming. Maybe it came for you like this one did for me in a season of great grief. Maybe it came after a loss that came too quickly. Or maybe it wasn't related to that at all. Maybe it came in a new vocation. Maybe it came with the birth of a child or a niece or a nephew. Things began to change. Maybe it came in an act of reconciliation or an act of forgiveness. Maybe it was with you and somebody else. Maybe it grew out of a relationship with somebody. Maybe it came on a second chance or a third chance. There are all kinds of ways and places where we experience the work of the divine, and I think maybe that's what it has in common, something that we can describe no better way than to say, I don't know. I just know that something happened. Have you had that experience? My guess is that if you would sit and reflect long enough, you could come up with one of those experiences, maybe more than that. Something that changed the way you understand the world and yourself, and perhaps maybe changed the way that you understand God. You see, we need these sort of mountaintop experiences. We need the extraordinary. We need the strength and the courage and the faith and the healing that comes from those moments, friends, because there are times where the outcome doesn't change. We need all of that because there are times that pandemics happen. There are times where healing doesn't come. There's times where the money doesn't show up, the job doesn't become available, reconciliation doesn't happen. There isn't a happily ever after at the end of the story. We need those experiences of faith because they sustain us in the difficult seasons of life. Where has that happened for you? It's good to reflect on those because they don't happen that often. Part of what our reading from Mark tells us is that Peter is in that moment and he wants to contain it. He wants to put God in a box. He wants to harness all of that energy. And so when he puts his foot in his mouth, what he says is, let me build a box for you and one for Elijah and one for Moses because this is good. But it doesn't seem that God is interested in that because finally, as Pastor Nanette has been driving home to us throughout this series, God will not be put in a box. God will not be controlled and manipulated and managed. And sometimes we have to be okay with the reality that there are things beyond our control. Sometimes we can find goodness and grace in those things because they are God moments. They are met in ways that we can't explain. We need these moments because the strength and the courage and the faith and the healing that we have in them, they will sustain us throughout life's journey. In our Old Testament reading today, as Sean said, in Daniel, there is a group of young men who have been victims of the exile, forcibly removed from their comfortable and leadership positions in Jerusalem and taken to Babylon. And even though they are promoted, or perhaps especially because they are promoted, they become targets from some of their peers. So their peers begin to devise a way that they could, get rid of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So King Nebuchadnezzar, he thinks he's God. He's had a golden statue almost 100 feet tall, built of himself. And then he calls all of his people together, and I have to read this, and we'll get into why here in just a minute. The satraps, the prefects, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of all the provinces. He gathers them together at this giant, ridiculous statue of himself, and he says, every time you hear the sound of the horn, the pipe, the lyre, the trigon, the harp, the drum, and the entire ensemble, everybody in all the world is to fall down and worship this statue, to worship me. He thinks he's God. And so he does all of this, and those peers that would want to get rid of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they go tattle. And they say, hey, king, these three guys from Jerusalem, they're not doing what you say. And he becomes enraged. So he calls them in and he says, surely you will, when you hear the sound of my whole band, you will bow down. Otherwise you will be thrown into the fire. And who is the God who can save you from my hand then? We need those mountaintop experiences because sometimes, friends, we face the furnace. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego give this poetically calm response. We have no need to defend ourselves. If our God is able to save us from you, O King, so be it. But even if not, we will not worship you. I have to tell you, this is one of my favorite stories in all of the scriptures. I was grateful that Pastor Nanette picked this, and then I was grateful that she picked this week to be on vacation so that I could preach it. She contemplated stealing it from me, but I said, no, I love this text. And I love this text because there is about it this cartoonish caricature nature. You see, the statue, it's 100 feet tall and it's gold, all the same. That list of officials that he brings, they list it over and over, the different people from different places, because there's this sort of poetic cadence to it. And every time the band plays, 4 times in this chapter, it talks about the band, but never does it say just the band. It says the horns, the pipe, the lyre, the trigon, the harp, the drum, and the entire musical ensemble. There is meant to be this sort of cartoonish nature. And so all of that happens. So when Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego give their response, the king doesn't take it very well. In fact, it says that his face becomes distorted with rage at the response. And then he calls his strongest men in the army to come and bind up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego as if they're going anywhere. And he has the furnace turned on not only to its normal heat, but 7 times the normal. Do you get the cartoonish nature of all this? The strong men that bind up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they're consumed by the fire because it is so hot. And then when Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are in the furnace, there is one, the scriptures say, who has the likeness of a God who is with them. And then it will be King Nebuchadnezzar himself who will call them out of that. I love this story. There's a lot of interesting pieces in it, but what Sean read today includes what I think may be one of the very most important lines in all of Scripture. They say to him, we have no need to answer you. If God can save us, so be it. But even if not. We talk about mountaintop experiences, miraculous interventions, things that we can't quite explain. I asked you to think of one of those moments. My guess is you can also readily think of times where the thing you hoped for, prayed for, wanted desperately, begged for, where that didn't happen. And the reason that I like this story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego is because it informs us of what our faith looks like when those things don't happen. I think it looks like the three of them staring at the one who will crush them, staring at the very reality of the oven to which they will be thrown, and saying, but even if not, we will not do as you say. You probably know that the path towards healing is rarely linear. Those years back in school, I was better some days and I was worse, but I remember vividly one evening, several weeks later, I was walking through our house and it was late on a weeknight, and one of my friends was laying on a couch, one who had been particularly close to the one who passed away. And he was crying. And I sat down and he put his head on my leg and he began to sob. And he would sob for longer than I thought a human being possibly could. And there was very few words exchanged between us in that moment as I just sat there. And eventually he would grow quiet and remain for a time. Eventually he stood up and I stood up and he gave me a hug, that sort of hug that is like holding on for dear life, and for all I know, maybe he was. But I think of that because not everybody had the highway experience that I did. You see, my one step in my journey towards healing came that night in that highway experience, the experience of something miraculous, inexplicable, extraordinary. And one step in his experience of healing came in that very tactile, human, simple, quiet moment. In life, we need the highways and the hugs. In life, we need the mountaintop experiences that will sustain us in the moments where we don't have that will sustain us through the valley or in the face of the fire. We need both of those things. And friends, it may just be that our experience of a mountaintop, or our experience of a healing that comes not from a mountaintop, maybe it's a much simpler, slower progression. Maybe when you lost a parent or a friend or some relationship, you have healed slowly over time, and you don't have a moment where you can point to where you said that wound was all bound up. But what happens is some years or months or decades later, you have a friend who goes through the same experience, and all of a sudden you find that there is this reservoir that you can pull from to help them go through their dark night, their difficult journey. It's why in premarital counseling, I often tell couples that I want to talk about how you deal with the difficulties that you'll inevitably face in life. And sometimes there's resistance to that. I don't know if it's because we think we'll never experience that, or we just don't want to think about the icky parts when things are so great. But that's exactly the moment when we need to, when we're walking on clouds, when we're having that mountaintop experience, thinking about how we will live our life together and what kind of ceremony we have and what kind of couple we want to be. It's in those moments that we can begin to build tools and resources and a reservoir from which we can draw when life inevitably gets more difficult, be that months or years down the road. That's why we talk about those things. We need those things in our faith as well. And it may be that our experiences, be they in the short term, as was my experience, or in the long term, that they will help others get through their experiences of difficulty. That is one of the greatest gifts, I think, that we have to share. That we might look at another going through some season of difficulty, facing some fire in their life, and that we might lend strength. That they would be able to make it through that season in their lives. Friends, our faith is a witness to the fact that we need both of these things. I think about it in terms of where we are right now. We're in the midst of a pandemic, and we're in a place where we thought that by this time we would be in the clear. And in fact, in the clear appears to be little more than a small light on the horizon. And so the question then becomes for us, are we able to pull on the experiences of community and of goodness and of strength that we've had in our life before? And are we able to tap into those reservoirs for the journey that we have ahead? Are they able to sustain us in this particular moment where we find ourselves today? For you, are there places where your mountaintop experience has sustained you in a valley? Or perhaps is there a place where your mountaintop experience has helped to sustain somebody else in their valleys? I think, friends, it is a sign of maturity in our faith when we recognize that we need both of these things. And when we grow to be able to tap into those experiences and name them and claim them, even if we can't explain them. I think it enables us to look at the times and the places where the phone call doesn't come, the healing doesn't happen, the reconciliation isn't on the horizon, things don't all go right, there's no fairy tale at the end, everybody's not happily ever after, circumstances don't change. It helps us to look at those places and say, but even if not. But what if not? What if you're not in that place right now? What if your season of spiritual dryness feels like it's dragging on and this feels like a sermon for somebody else in a better place? One of my deepest hopes for us as a community is that you would allow community around you, that you would allow us as pastors and as a church to come around you. And in those places where you can't honestly say, but even if not, that you would allow us to join you with prayer, asking for the miraculous, for the extraordinary, for that which can't be explained, asking for the healing to come or the newness to be available or to be realized, that we could join with you in that. And perhaps if you yourself can't yet say it, that maybe those around you would say, but even if not, let us remember that God will not abandon you, and neither will we. That is one of my strongest hopes for community. So friends, whether you find yourself recently off, or maybe in the midst of some transformative, transfiguration, mountaintop, extraordinary experience, or if you find yourself facing the fire completely dried out, deep down in the valley, there are ways and places for us to grow. We can be assured that God indeed is with us in all of those places. And we can remember that we have the opportunity to share in community the strength that comes from the highest mountaintop and the struggle that comes from the deepest valley. So may it be for each one of us. Amen.